So last week, some friends of mine were discussing the prospect of a potential Legend of Zelda screen adaptation in the wake of a cancelled Netflix project. And this made me wonder, A, why hasn't there been a Legend of Zelda movie or TV series, besides the 80s cartoon? And B, could such a series work, and how? The Legend of Zelda was absolutely my favourite video game series as a child, and I did always wonder back then why they never made a movie or TV show about it. As an adult, I now realise it's likely down to the Super Mario Bros. Movie being such a disaster in the eyes of, well, pretty much everyone, including Nintendo. But now that Detective Pikachu seems to have broken the video game movie curse, and Nintendo was at least willing to entertain the idea of a Legend of Zelda Netflix series, well, it's an option now, right? So today, I want to do something I've not really done before. Rather than talking about how I would rewrite a story that's already been done but poorly, I want to speculate on how I would adapt a story that has never been properly made before. Specifically, how do I think a TV adaptation of the Legend of Zelda franchise should be written? So to begin with, we need to discuss the main story of the franchise. Right, so basically, most Zelda games follow a specific pattern. There's always a hero named Link, who is a young man dressed in green. There's always a princess named Zelda, and there's always a power-hungry villain, usually Ganondorf, and more often than not, the story involves the hero and the princess doing their best to stop the villain from gaining the ultimate treasure of the gods known as the Triforce and taking over the land of Hyrule. This isn't always the case, there are some games that deviate from their formula, but it is the most common plot. Now, while that seems like a simple enough idea, the infamous timeline kind of complicates things. Okay, let me explain that. See, chronologically, the first game is Skyward Sword, which sees Link and Zelda defeat the evil King Demise, who upon his death unleashes a curse that ensures the three of them will be forever reborn and their story will repeat itself for ages to come. And this continues until we reach Ocarina of Time, where the Hero of Time, after defeating evil King Ganondorf, goes back in time to prevent the events of the game from happening, thus creating a new timeline, aka the child timeline, but also leaving behind the old timeline, aka the adult timeline, and somehow creating a third timeline in which the hero lost, aka the Fallen Hero timeline. And ever since then, every game, with the possible exception of Breath of the Wild, has fallen onto one of these timelines. While some games are direct sequels to each other, most games do take place centuries apart, with a different hero each time, all of which are canonically named Link, but are separated by their titles, like the Hero of Time or the Hero of Winds. So when it comes to creating a Zelda TV series, the first question is, which one should be adapted? And that's a tough question, since with the exception of the games that are intended to be direct sequels like Majora's Mask or Phantom Hourglass, a lot of them would work fine as starting points. Some might say that Skyward Sword should be the first one, given it is chronologically the first story in the timeline. And I'd certainly be up for that, but Skyward Sword isn't the most well known of the games. That would arguably be Ocarina of Time, the game that really put Zelda on the map and became pretty much the standard that all of the Zelda games have followed. And there's also Breath of the Wild, the game with the largest, most expansive world in the series, which could provide a lot of basis for stories. These are all good options, but there is of course the option of not even basing it on one of the specific games. Because like I said, the whole point of the Zelda franchise is that it is a series of stories repeated over centuries. There have been numerous Links, numerous Zeldas, numerous reincarnations of Demise's hatred, and numerous stories revolving around the three of them. You could easily just create yet another hero and another story with brand new characters, and inevitably a slew of new debates as to where it fits on the timeline. But while the chosen game to be adapted from is one thing, there's also the question of how it should be presented on screen. How light or dark should the tone be? Who should the audience be? And should it be live action or animated? The cancelled Netflix adaptation was supposedly being planned as Game of Thrones for kids, which, okay, it is an option, I won't lie. Though it's also an option I don't think Nintendo especially approved of, and I guess I can see why. Don't get me wrong, The Legend of Zelda has always been a surprisingly dark series, with many moments that do delve into some sinister territory. But it was never really a desperate, edgy kind of darkness or adult themes trying to make the games more quote-unquote mature. Tone-wise, I'd say a Legend of Zelda series should strike a balance between the dark and sinister and the quirky and wholesome, similar to a series like Over the Garden Wall. For that reason, I feel like it'd be better as an animated series. For starters, I think it is a series that I feel should be for children, even if it is mature. And second, when it comes to more mature and dark content, since animation is often viewed as being for kids, thus has less freedom as to what it can show, it can often turn that weakness into a strength, as writers often have to get a lot more creative and subtle with how they present such content, which can lead down a lot of very interesting paths. When it comes to the story and how it's presented, well, regardless of which game is selected, there is one thing to consider, and that's that the Legend of Zelda games have never been particularly story-driven. Don't get me wrong, this isn't always the case, but often the story of Zelda games are very simplistic, and that's not a bad thing. The games are brilliant at what they do, that being providing all kinds of fun puzzles, dungeons and exploration, with basic plots and fun little side quests. And that's fine for a video game, but maybe it doesn't translate so well to the TV screen. So what should be done? Well, for the most part, while the games do tell a very simple story, that's not to say there isn't something deeper lying underneath, often in the form of strange mysteries of the series and potential stories not expanded upon. A good example is the cutscene before the Ganon fight in Wind Waker that suggests that Ganondorf actually had a fairly tragic backstory that we never knew about in Ocarina of Time. Many games do introduce characters that have a lot of potential for development, who could play far larger roles in the show than they do in the games. The plot doesn't necessarily all have to be from Link's perspective either. You could easily show scenes involving Zelda or Ganondorf or any other characters that are relevant, and maybe explain things that weren't explained in the games, like how the Happy Mask salesman obtained Majora's Mask, the origins of Snow Peak ruins, or just how did Link change his clothes in the Temple of Light. But while these are all fine suggestions, there's still the question of how I personally would like the series to be made. Well, first of all, like I said, make it animated. Specifically, an Avatar The Last Airbender style animated series, aimed towards kids but appealing for adults, that follows a story rather than being episodic. And personally, I guess I'd just choose Ocarina of Time as the starting point. Have the story play out as it does in the games, with young Link being sent on a quest to stop Ganondorf claiming the Triforce using the spiritual stones, only to fail and awaken 7 years later in a corrupted Hyrule with a new quest to awaken the 6 sages. Make it about 22 episodes long, with the first 10 or so dedicated to young Link and the second half to adult Link. As stated earlier, I would expand the plot a little and put more focus on various characters. Feature more scenes with the different sages, and give them more characterization, plus expand upon their relationship with Link. Like, say, have more scenes of Link's childhood with Saria, and have Zelda be the secondary protagonist, with a lot of scenes from her perspective. And since at this point it's pretty well known that Zelda and Sheik are the same person, don't bother making this a final act twist, and instead actually give us some content of Zelda taking on the persona of Sheik and what she gets up to. Consider a 2-part episode in the middle of the series, where, after Link has obtained the stones, we actually see Ganondorf unleashing his attack on Hyrule Castle, which Zelda and Impa narrowly escape from. As in the games, have Link open the Door of Time and retrieve the Master Sword, but this leads to Ganondorf's message of victory, and Link awakening to Rauru explaining he's been frozen for 7 years. Have the episode end with him meeting Sheik, who gives the usual explanation and vanishes, then reveals, away from Link, that she is Zelda. And have part 2 be a flashback episode dedicated to Sheik's exploits over the years, witnessing all of the changes in Hyrule and how they happened, like the freezing of Zora's domain and the imprisonment of the Gorons, to show just what has gone on in Link's absence. When it comes to the dungeons of the game, as fun as the puzzles and such are, that might not translate so well to the big screen, so instead, put focus on really getting across the exploration and atmosphere. Imagine for a moment an animated child Link crawling through that little hole at the beginning of the Spirit Temple, then climbing out and setting eyes upon a gorgeously animated, mysterious, treasure-filled desert temple as that loud, iconic theme begins to play. And take advantage of the opportunity for Link to really interact with his surroundings, as it could provide some interesting content, like, say, acknowledging just how screwed up some of the implications of the Shadow Temple are, and what its purpose really was. And finally, there is one important question I need to ask. Should Link speak? There's some debate as to whether or not Link should ever have a voice, since on one hand there's implications in games that he can talk, but on the other hand Link is a famously silent protagonist, who has never truly spoken in games except for Wind Waker, where he can clearly say the words "come on" when calling people, but this is Ocarina of Time and the hero of time doesn't speak, so yeah, I would have Link as a mute, who can communicate through subtitled sign language when he needs to, with Navi doing a lot of the talking, as she is known to do. It's a nice bit of representation, plus the idea of a mostly silent protagonist can work. It's worked in cartoons before, and it gives a lot of opportunity for wordless storytelling. Sometimes scenes can get a lot across to the audience without ever having to say anything. In fact, given Link's backstory is he's born in the middle of a war and rescued by his dying mother who brought him to the forest, writers say that he sustained an injury during the escape that made it so he grew up mute. But all that said, this is just one option. There are countless possibilities for making a show out of the series. Not all of them are good, but you can't deny the overall potential. And I personally think that the best way to go about creating a great series would be to simply stay true to the spirit of the games. Don't try to make it more edgy or adult, don't try to make it unnecessarily hip or contemporary. While things will always need to be changed, what's most important is that the quirkiness, sense of adventure, and themes of heroic underdog courage defeating tyrannical power will always remain true. Thanks for watching the video. I have been feeling quite tired and burnt out recently, so I figured I'd just do a nice video focused on one of my all-time favourite video game series. And if folks like it, maybe I'll do more vids in future about how I'd adapt particular media into shows and movies. I might even consider doing how I'd adapt a Majora's Mask sequel to the Ocarina of Time idea, given both are two of my all-time favourite games. In the meantime, like, share, subscribe and donate to me on Patreon if you can. I'll try to keep doing a video once a week, but just be aware I may have to skip it from time to time if I'm feeling especially burnt out. But otherwise, I do hope to speak to you all again soon. Goodbye.